Pong Sutirak. I'm the director of the Institute of Security International Studies, ISIS Thailand, based at Chulalongkorn University's Faculty of Political Science. Good morning from here, and greetings to everyone watching us, tuning in. It's my pleasure today to organize this book launch webinar, not just a book launch, but a wider discussion about China and Southeast Asia. We have a book here that I want to start off with called The Rivers of Iron. I have it here. And those of you who have seen the advert, the publicity for this event will know that the book is written by 3 authors after extensive, first-rate research on the ground. For researchers, it's always energizing. It's impressive to see how researchers can be getting into the mud, very firsthand, very primary. So there are some photos of the 3 authors in the mud and looking at the construction of the rail lines from China to mainland Southeast Asia. So the 3 speakers we have mainly today, apart from the discussant, is Professor Lampton, Professor David Lampton. He is a senior fellow at the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute. SAIS is the School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University, where Professor Lampton is also an emeritus professor there. He's written many books and many articles. He's a lifelong China expert and authority. He's eminent and distinguished. His bio is available around, and we've passed it around. I also would like to introduce Dr. Selina Ho, our second speaker. Dr. Selina Ho is an assistant professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School at the NUS in Singapore. She's also in charge, the director of the Master of International Affairs program. She's a co-author of the book. And then Dr. Cheng-Chwee Kuik, who is a professor, associate professor at UKM, head of the Center for Asian Studies at the National University of Malaysia, UKM. He's also written many articles and books. For our viewers, we have a diverse range. You can know that these 3 authors, Professor Lampton is a lifelong accomplished writer, author on China and Asian affairs in general. So are Dr. Selina Ho and Dr. Cheng-Chwee Kuik. Our discussant for a wider discussion, a wider panel, is Dr. Arm Tungnirun. Dr. Arm is the director of the China Studies Center at Chulalongkorn, my colleague, my younger colleague, up and coming rising star within our China expertise, China experts community in Thailand. Dr. Arm has lectured widely in Thailand and abroad. He's written many articles as well on China and Southeast Asia. So on that note, we have, can you put up a map, please, our tech team of the Belt and Road Initiative. So, this is the middle of the pandemic. In the last year and a half, last almost 2 years, it's just incredible what's happened. But nevertheless, China's role, impact, influence in Southeast Asia is still, I think, intact and on track. Prior to the pandemic, there was a big, BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, was China's geostrategy, grand strategy, if you will, to kind of, in my view, regained its kind of manifest return to the Asian landmass. The Belt and Road, if you look at the map, it harks back to the old Silk Road 1,000 years ago. So I think this is something that China has been peddling, pursuing since 2012, 2013, with the rise of President Xi Jinping. There are a lot of issues now because the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI projects, are perhaps in question and maybe has been slowed by the pandemic. It hasn't been derailed, but the future may be a bit problematic or questionable, somewhat doubtful, or maybe not. Maybe it's very much on track, and then we will see BRI projects mushrooming around the region all the way to Europe and Africa. So I'm going to go around to the authors of the book, the 3 authors, and then they will make a kind of 10-minute presentation each, roughly, with some flexibility, and then we'll go from there. So Professor Lampton first, and then Dr. Selina Ho, and then Dr. Cheng-Chwee Kuik. Of course, this is a grand book to the three authors. You know, I love seeing the photos of the mud that you were all in, and then all the kind of the primary field research. You know, getting your hands down and dirty and coming out with this great piece of work. I think it also has gone around, well circulated, exposed. I think people are very interested in it. But if it has to be updated, you know, the pandemic has thrown a spanner into the works, which means that it is a bit of a unexpected external shock that we all have to grapple with. Does this change the book in any way? Does it change? Has it adversely or favorably affected BRI, the role of China in Southeast Asia? Those of us who are listening to this, if you imagine a Belt and Road, there's a gap between the belt and the road, and that gap is filled by 6 corridors. Where we are in mainland Southeast Asia, that corridor is called a CICPEC, China Indochina Peninsula Economic Corridor, CICPEC. And CICPEC has a train line running from Yunnan province all the way down to Singapore, passing through Thailand, Northeast Thailand, Bangkok, all the way to southern Thailand, through Malaysia to Singapore. Now, that's a grand plan. I mean, it's an unbelievable plan. It could connect Bangkok to the Laos border and to China. We can take a train there to Kunming, capital of Yunnan, within half a day. That would be amazing. On the other hand, we already have now the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. On August 25th, there was a big announcement that China now has a rail line running to the Indian Ocean. It has been finished. It is running from Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan province, to the Shan state, and then down through Myanmar, to the Indian Ocean. And this is part of the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, focusing on Jokpyu in Rakhine State, the port there. So it's happening. And the one dimension also I want to cover is the domestic concerns or the domestic vulnerabilities and liabilities for BRI projects. In Myanmar, there are concerns that, you know, because of the coup in February and now the armed insurrection and kind of a civil war, that maybe the ethnic armed organizations could sabotage this Chinese rail to the Indian Ocean. And it brings up the issue of domestic liabilities and domestic opposition to BRI projects. And we can also see some of the other opposition groups in other countries of the BRI recipients. So on that note, I don't want to go too long. I want to focus on the book itself and beyond the book. I'll invite first Professor Lampton to maybe cast your eye on what the book has written, but at the same time, if you were to update it a little bit in view of the pandemic, what would you say? What would be the new elements, the additional chapters? Professor Lampton.
Well, thank you very much. And we're really pleased to be here. And lest I forget, I want to thank the Thai people in particular. We were there in doing extensive field research and went by ground from Bangkok to Nong Khai and then into Laos. And the Thai people were open, friendly, very helpful, and we're eternally grateful. So I want to make that express that thank you on behalf of our whole team. And I want to thank you, Professor Thitinan, for all the efforts you've made to put this program together, and obviously for all the thought, even your initial questions demonstrate. I know people will be interested, and you expect the question of what might we say differently, or what has been the implication of what's happened since our book's published. And let me just tick off a couple of things there, and then I'd like to just introduce the book. I think the book is, in many respects, about a lot more than the railroads. So I think this is a case study that has application about how the Chinese are thinking about development, how they're thinking about their role in the world, how their foreign policy may conflict with some of their domestic policy and their other areas of foreign policy that conflict. So I would say the book is a case study that generalizes about things that are on people's mind, the nature of the political system and so forth. But in terms of, I'd say a number of things. You mentioned 6 corridors. I think those 6 corridors have actually different economic potential. And certainly in the book, we think Southeast Asia is the group, if not the greatest, certainly among the greatest economic potential from China's point of view. I think it'd be my view, and my colleagues can express their own view, that the Chinese probably see the Southeast Asian corridor as the most important, and therefore I think they'll put very high priority on not having it disrupted. So I think there'll be, as you said, some slowing down, but not derailing. Also, I should say the Chinese, of course, began these projects, 2015, 2016. They already were learning lessons before COVID hit. They were learning about the risk of these projects in several countries. Also, Pakistan, very risky. So they were becoming more cautious. Also, some of the, what you might call partner countries were becoming increasingly worried about some of the debt burdens and environmental impacts. And the Chinese were becoming more cautious and fearful. They were overcommitted. So I would say some of the slowdown probably was, we couldn't see it too clearly, but probably the slowdown was beginning a bit, or what you might call more caution, even before COVID. But I think the main point I would say is I don't think the Chinese vision of its role, its economic role in Asia, and its vision of helping and assisting the building of infrastructure in Southeast Asia in order to see Southeast Asia grow, prosper, and make China richer. So I don't think the fundamental Chinese vision has changed. As you say, it, I think, may slow a bit, but it hasn't been derailed. And in fact, the section that we talk about most, the central section in Laos, is right on schedule. It was articulated before the COVID crisis broke out. So I wouldn't exaggerate the amount of change, but I think the book is about more than just those railroads. But in any case, let me just introduce the book a bit. First of all, I think one of the important settings is there's all this talk in the West, and particularly the United States, and we might want to talk about it, about economic decoupling from China. And I guess our book is dedicated to the proposition that building connections, economic globalization is not dead. I think the strategic concerns about key industries and disconnecting or reducing our reliance on key strategic supply chains with China will probably proceed. But the basic trend, we believe, is to be continued connectivity, supply chain development, and Southeast Asia is extremely important to China's plans to develop its own supply chain. And for some time, as you know better than I, supply chains have been moving to Southeast Asia in the shoe industry, textile industry. Labor costs are going up in China, and China wants to offload the lower value added to Southeast Asia and elsewhere as well. But so I think the basic pattern of supply chain development will continue in Southeast Asia is very important. Now, this book also is about what I would call industrial policy. And in that sense, I don't think, the intervening events of COVID and so on much have affected that. And that uh, the first question is, how did China develop this high-speed rail industry so rapidly? In the year 2000, China had virtually no industry, high-speed rail industry at all. And through a very concerted, almost Manhattan nuclear project like policy, developed this industry from the ground up. So this book describes the contours of China's industrial policy and how they built a domestic industry. And of course, one of the big problems that the West and many countries with high tech in particular are interested in competition, how China promotes its key industries, and what are the implications for us in terms of, does China subsidize? Does China take intellectual property without paying adequately for it? And our book deals with all of those set of questions. Certainly, I think the book deals with a number of other issues. Uh, Certainly, you could ask, this is a mammoth project we're talking about. If you put up the map of the rail system, I think you can get an idea of how massive it is. This network, these are planned. Some of these black lines have actually been built. Some are just in the beginning stages. Some are getting upgraded. But the point is that this is basically three north-south lines that start, at least in China, in Kunming, and one to the east goes through Hanoi along the coast down to Ho Chi Minh City to Phnom Penh and Bangkok. The second goes down through Laos, Thailand to Bangkok, and the third line goes from Kunming down through Myanmar to Bangkok. You can see from the map actually that Bangkok is in a very strategic position. So Thailand is really, I think, for the Chinese and certainly for the whole system, is the most strategic point. Certainly, I will be interested in what our Thai colleagues have to say, but it appears to me that Bangkok is sort of in this system playing a similar role to the role that Chicago played in the development of the American transcontinental railroad system, our rail system, north, south, east, west, highways as well as rails, and of course I think it's still our biggest airport is in Chicago. So it seems to me that Bangkok is the absolute sort of strategic center for this project. And then all three of those north-south lines to Bangkok then go south down the Malay Peninsula, ultimately under this vision to Singapore. Each of those three lines from Kunming to Singapore is longer than the transcontinental railroad of the United States. So a whole nother set of issues are, what are the problems that China encounters in this? What implementation problems? And of course, that whole question of implementation is a general question that applies to Chinese projects all over the world. So once again, this book is about something bigger than just this railroad project. Also, this book is about something more fundamental than just this railroad project, and that is, how does China negotiate with its potential partners? What levers does it have? What levers do the partner countries, whether it's Thailand, and Thailand's had a lot of leverage in its negotiations with China. So to answer your question, Tidinan, I think this book, yes, it came out in 2020. A lot's happened since, But at least the thing I'm proud of in the book is that we're dealing with fundamental issues and using this as a set of case studies to address those issues. And I think my conclusions, and I can't, my colleagues, I think agree with me, wouldn't change on those fundamental issues very much. I just also want to say one other thing, and that is that I think we have to recognize, and I'm speaking in a way to Americans, I think Americans have to recognize China has a very strategic long-term vision. That doesn't mean that it implements that strategy always very effectively, but it sees itself as the economic hub of Asia. And it's building multimodal connectivity to make itself the economic hub of Asia. But China also sees that it can't get rich if all its neighbors are poor. So China, there is a win-win dimension to this, at least in theory, and we'll have to see in practice. Because, there have been studies, development studies for a long time, and show it's easier to get rich in a rich neighborhood than a poor neighborhood. So I think the Chinese are in this for the long haul. And America and other countries in East Asia have to decide how central do they want China to this emerging structure, economic and transportation structure. And China will be central. But how central and how diversified do Southeast Asian countries and certainly Quad countries like the United States, Japan, India, Australia, all have an interest in the economic structure of emerging Southeast Asia. So I think this book is really about that fundamental issue. And I would just end by saying, if I were talking to my own government on this, I would say our objective shouldn't be to frustrate or make more difficult Chinese projects, but we ought to build, China's building north-south connectivity. We ought to think about how to balance that north-south connectivity, that flow towards China, with an east-west connectivity that knits together Southeast Asia, Japan, India. And so I think we can have a positive vision of connectivity without making it an anti-China program. But Selina, you want to go on?
Okay, thank you. Let me just put in a word here. Thank you very much, Professor Lampton. So instead of the pandemic maybe affecting the book Rivers of Iron, I think you've made the case that it's the other way around, that the book has transcended the pandemic, and that the fundamental issues involved, from the supply chains, industrial policy, and how recipient countries receive the role and impact of China is very much on track. Okay, I think we have a lot to think about from your presentation, Professor Lampton. We're going to come back to it. In the meantime, let me invite Dr. Selina Ho. I think you have a presentation. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Thitinan, and thank you, Professor Lampton. That was an excellent summary, Professor Thitinan, on what Professor Lampton said. Now, one of the other main contributions of the book is that 3 out of the 8 chapters actually focus on the role of the smaller powers in Southeast Asia. So it's significant because, in international relations theory, we actually do not, focus on smaller powers. We always look at great power politics and say that, smaller powers have no agency or no impact on international structures. But in our book and in our research, we find that small states can resist, they modify, they challenge, they initiate, they negotiate, and they bargain. And in the process, we also learn and improve our understanding of what are the limits and the extent of Chinese power. So I think that's another very valuable addition to the book. So what I'm going to do in my portion is to talk about what determines the bargaining power of the smaller states and the implementation process that tells us, what smaller states can actually do in terms of holding bigger powers accountable. Dave, can you show the next slide, please? Dave? Okay, this is actually just a picture of the field work that we did in Laos. You can see all the mud that Professor Titinan was talking about when we were looking at the construction sites. We had a really good time, as you can tell from the smiles on our face. The next slide, please. So we have come up with 3 conditions that determine the bargaining power of the smaller states as they negotiate with China. And the very first one that we talk about is the size, wealth, and is that size, wealth, and location actually matter. So middle powers like Indonesia and Thailand actually have greater leverage than Laos and are able to better bargain for themselves. For instance, Indonesia was able to get the Chinese to agree to not having any sovereign guarantees for the project, as well as a lower interest rate. Now, Malaysia and Singapore, of course, are better developed and middle-income countries, and this helps in their negotiating power as well. And as you can see from the map earlier, and which Professor Lampton has emphasized, geography really gives Thailand a major advantage. All the routes of the Pan-Asia Railway must pass through Thailand, which strengthens its ability to bargain with China. In fact, during one of the interviews that we had with a very high-ranking government advisor, Thai government advisor, he described Thailand, and I quote, as a beautiful woman who can wait to choose the best suitor. Obviously, the best suitor refers to the slate of great powers that actually come wooing at Thailand's doorsteps. Now, for Laos, geography is definitely not an asset. It can be bypassed to its east and its west. So, in fact, in our interviews, in the fieldwork that we did, there was significant anxiety on their part, and law officials expressed their anxiety that they will be bypassed in this railway that is being constructed. Now, the second factor that determines the bargaining power of smaller states is state capacity, such as robust government institutions, civil society, rule of law, human resources, and regulative and monitoring abilities as well. So Singapore has state capacity and is not overly reliant on China economically. So that helps Singapore in this whole process. However, again, countries like Laos are heavily reliant on the Chinese economy and technical expertise. For instance, the feasibility study that was done for the China-Laos Railway was actually conducted by the Chinese themselves. The third factor that determines the bargaining power of smaller states is domestic politics and public opinion. And they play a huge role in how much bargaining power smaller states have. Now, Cheng-Chwee will touch more on this in his portion of the presentation. But let me outline some key points here. Well, if you think of bargaining as a 2-level game, and at the international level, you have the bargaining that happens between countries and between international actors. The second level is bargaining among domestic agencies. And here, public opinion actually play a large role. For example, leaders like the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Najib Razak, and Indonesian President Jokowi have been attacked for selling their countries to China. There are also concerns over whether locals will benefit in terms of technological transfer, job creation, and also Chinese companies often bring in their own materials and equipment. Well, where does that leave, local SMEs? So there's just this very big question of whether economies will actually benefit from this. So negative public opinion and unhappiness over Chinese presence also assert significant pressures on leaders. So if you were to think about the 2-level theory, at the level 2, the domestic level, the wind sets of the Southeast Asian countries are actually quite small. But then this ironically actually strengthens the bargaining power of small states, because when they negotiate with China at level 1, they can actually go to China and say, if we want to pass this in my country and you're really putting my domestic position at stake, you really have to give us more concessions. So this really, domestic politics can be a leverage then that politicians in the region can use when they bargain with China. So now let me turn to the challenges of implementation. Dave, next slide. Thank you. So as Chinese companies venture into South Asia, they encounter all sorts of problems and issues which they really, really are not familiar with when they operate at home. There's a lot of trial and error involved, a lot of learning involved. Not that there were, any problems with not that there were no problems implementation within China, but these problems actually multiply when they are out of their country and they're not familiar with the various political systems they have to encounter, with many political actors and veto points. So, for instance, decentralization and land acquisition, that is an issue. When they venture into Indonesia, they encounter decentralization politics when they acquire land. Now, land acquisition is the first phase of the entire construction process. So as a result of the delays in land acquisition, the project has been delayed for several years. So, pre-COVID, these delays have always been part and parcel of the construction of these railways. It's not something that is a product of COVID per se. So in Indonesia's case, decentralization post 1998, we know that Jakarta itself, the center, has actually weakened, and local regencies have actually been empowered, have been strengthened. So in the Jakarta-Bandung Railway, the agreement was essentially between Beijing and Jakarta, but without inputs from the local regencies. As a result of which, when Chinese companies try to acquire land from local governments, they encounter resistance. And this is a huge problem because in total, 29 districts and 95 villages in West Java are directly impacted by the Jakarta-Bandung Railway. So you can imagine the amount of difficulties that Chinese companies actually go through as they deal with very powerful local authorities and the very strong land tenure laws in Indonesia. Another factor that has hindered implementation is bureaucratic resistance. And you see this very clearly when we did our fieldwork in Thailand, right? For example, the State Railway Authority of Thailand actually makes money by selling land, but loses money when they on rail operations. When they operate rail, they actually lose money in the process. So one of the key issues that came up during the negotiation process was, how do you compensate for the loss of land? How do you compensate the State Railway Authority of Thailand for that? So that's one of the key issues that hindered the construction process. There are also significant legal obstacles to the construction of the Bangkok-Nong Khai high-speed railway. The laws that offer labor protection, procurement standards, land usage, and environmental protection. All these are wonderful laws, and they do speak to the state capacity that Thailand has. But they do, in reality, have the effect of slowing things down. So what happened was Prime Minister Prayut had to invoke Article 44 to overcome these legal barriers in order to push forward the project. Now, the other thing is that for any infrastructure project, and especially for railways which cross many jurisdictions, having a champion is actually really important. In Malaysia, for instance, you have former Prime Minister Najib. He is a very, very strong supporter, champion of the East Coast Railway, railing, and the Kuala Lumpur-Singapore high-speed rail. However, he unexpectedly lost power in the May 2018 general elections. As a result of these projects, the KL-Singapore high-speed railway, the East Coast Railing, lost a very, very powerful patron. And, but subsequently, you have the Mahathir government that came in to renegotiate the East Coast Railing with China, and Malaysia actually got better terms for itself. So there was leverage that Malaysia could use here. Now, the KL-Singapore high-speed railway has been cancelled, but those were due to different reasons, and we can explore that later on in our conversation. Now, the other obstacles are a lot more technical. Laos is an example. Many tunnels and bridges have to be built. Laos, you also have to deal with all these unexploded mines that Americans left behind during the Vietnam War. So these are all challenges that the Chinese have to face. So what I'm really trying to say here is that one of the key things that we try to understand from the book is how much impact and how much agency that smaller states have, and the kind as a result of which, it really shows the limits and extent of Chinese power. And this is one of the important messages that we want to put across. And a lot of these projects, just to have a word on the impact of COVID and what's currently happening here. Laos case, the Laos China-Laos Railway actually is moving ahead and is on schedule. They'll be completed by December end of this year, December 2021. So it's on schedule. I think there were some delays in the Thailand and Jakarta Bandung case, but I don't think these delays are going to be significant. So as Professor Lampton said previously, that this project there may be delays, but these delays are not a product of COVID per se. They were pre-COVID, and maybe COVID slowed it down a little bit more, but the vision is still there. It's on track. And we're going to see that this is going to carry on even after COVID. Now, Cheng-Chwee will actually be elaborating more on what's happening within South Asia and how they reacted to China, and as well as the geopolitical and geoeconomic aspects of the competition with the other major powers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Selina. Before I invite Dr. Cheng-Chwee Kuik to come in, let me just follow up here a little bit to Selina and Professor Lampton, and also Cheng-Chwee. There's a primacy and tyranny, if you will, of geography. Professor Lampton, you mentioned Bangkok is really the essential hub. Without Bangkok, without going through Thailand, this entire railway network just doesn't work, right? So the geography is the reality, but the rail in Thailand not making much progress. I think this goes back some years since the military coup in 2014. You mentioned some resistance, Selina, bureaucratic resistance, technical challenges, and so on. So is it possible? I mean, the Thai rail, I'm not seeing it. I think we've built several kilometers in the Northeast, whereas I think on the drawing board was 637 kilometers to connect Nong Khai to Bangkok. So if this doesn't happen, if Thailand is not building the rail in the near term, what would happen? I mean, you would have it going through Myanmar a little bit. The rail from Kunming to Vientiane in Laos would just stay there, would just be stuck there, not connecting to the ocean, to the Gulf of Thailand. Well, what's the prospect, you think? And then in that light, Xi Jinping, his term is coming up. And if he has another third term, okay, he gets another lease. But it looks problematic a little bit to me going through Thailand because it's not happening, not being constructed. Professor Lampton, Selina, Cheng-Chwee, what do you think? Thailand is a hub, but not happening.
Well, I'll just pick off one part of your question about Xi Jinping and the continuity of leadership in China. Of course, anything can happen. Xi Jinping is mortal, and so there are a set of health possibilities. But I would say the overwhelming odds is Xi Jinping is going to be around for a long time. Now, that's not to exclude the possibility that there are dissatisfactions in China and unexpected pressure could be put on him. But I think the overwhelming likelihood is that Xi Jinping's going to go on in an important leadership role beyond the 20th Party Congress. So I anticipate he has made this his signature project, is the core of his foreign policy in a sense. And therefore, if I expect him to stick around, I guess I have to expect the commitment for this policy to stick around. You also ask, well, okay, so if Thailand doesn't play the role that it could play, I think the Chinese will continue doing what they are doing now, and that is pick targets of opportunity. They've already built a line, to the Indian Ocean through Burma. They've also old line that runs between China and Hanoi and Haiphong was a very profitable, relatively profitable line, and could be much more so if China improves its relations with Vietnam. So I would say they will go for targets of opportunity, but the question is, will China's foreign policy produce cooperation, in particularly in Vietnam? So I would say China could move ahead with Vietnam if it improved its foreign policy. But of course, the maritime disputes don't make the Vietnamese very pliable as far as the Chinese are concerned. So I expect it to go ahead. The Chinese get targets of opportunity, but they're going to have to get their foreign policy in alignment with their international economic policy.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Maybe
Selina?
I can add a little bit. I think that Professor Lampton is absolutely right. Xi will probably stay for another term at least. And so, for his legacy, it's very likely that he will want to see the BRI. If the BRI were to be thrown out overnight, I think that would be terrible for his legacy. I think that's a very important consideration. Now, some people actually talk about the dual circulation strategy or policy that was announced early on. The refocusing of Chinese development on domestic development and domestic development of the economy, rather than trying to put so much of the resources overseas. But I think that we have to be very careful how we look at it. The dual circulation strategy is really in response to the US-China trade war, tech war, or however you want to see it. It does not, however, mean a de-emphasize of the external China putting resources overseas, because it is key to spreading Chinese influence, and Southeast Asia is a very key component of this. Now, the Thailand stretch is happening in phases. So what you saw were those few kilometers in the first phase of the first phase. There were a few phases that were going to happen. So the first phase of the first phase was the showcase to try and win popular support. I think you know that better than me, Professor Titinan. But so I think the Chinese are going to try and push ahead, and as long as this government continues, the private government continues to support it, I think that's likely to continue, although very slowly. So this is again pre-COVID, pre everything that we're currently facing now. If you recall the map that we showed just now, of the three routes, the one in the center, the one that goes through Thailand, was the most feasible, precisely for political and economic reasons. Myanmar and Vietnam were not good alternatives. So even in exactly as Professor Lampton said about the issue with Vietnam, it has to do with South China Sea. The Vietnamese are extremely wary of the Chinese, so it's unlikely that they're going to, allow this development to go ahead, especially when some of the light rail developments that the Chinese have constructed have been a source of public unhappiness. Now, in Myanmar's case, with the junta in power, you will see that they are moving closer to China again. But then public opinion is extremely against what the Chinese are doing in their own country. If you remember the dam, the Mitsuni Dam, that was the issue. It was put to a stop because of protests against the construction. So there'll be public resistance in Myanmar. So in any case, I think the best chance in Southeast Asia for the Pan-Asia Railway is actually through Thailand. And I think the Chinese will continue pushing for it.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just note, there's a distinction between public opinion and state authority and the government, the ruling government. So the Chinese seem to me they deal with governments. They don't have much concern for public opinion as much. But in the longer term, this could be consequential. Dr. Cheng-Chwee, Kuik, the floor is yours. I know you've been patiently waiting for your turn. Please go ahead, and you have about 10 minutes. And maybe you can also touch, I'm sure you will, on the Malaysian rail.
Thank you very much, Professor Titinan. And Sawadee Krap, good morning, everybody. First of all, let me thank the organizer, ISIS Thailand, and particularly my good friends, Arjan J, and also I know Cheng-Chwee is also there. Thanks for having us here. So on the basis of what Professor Lampton and also Selina have presented, let me cover two things and in the process, hopefully also to add on what Mike and also Selina have responded to Professor Titinan's very good question. So I would cover two things which are about responses, and then secondly about geoeconomics and also geopolitics. So I would ask Dave help to show our slide that shows we have a 2x2 matrix that help to project and also illustrate the issue of how and why smaller countries in Southeast Asia have responded to China-backed railroad projects differently. So we have these four quadrants that show the issue of how, and also the two metrics there, the two axes that show and also explain the issue of why. So Arjan Titinan has invited us to kind of provide an update since the book was completed 2 years ago, basically before COVID BC. So what happened, the changes after the completion of the book actually confirm what we have presented generally and also here with this 2x2 matrix. So the key patterns that are being captured in these metrics generally confirm by all the changes that have been taking place since the completion for our book. For example, quadrant 1 and 2 represented by Laos and Malaysia. The two countries, the two patterns continue to be more enthusiastic, more receptive than quadrant 3 and 4 represented by Thailand and also Vietnam. For example, as mentioned by Selina, Laos, in the case of Laos, is on track despite COVID. We know that on December 2nd, which is a few months from now, the Lao-China high-speed railroad project will be open and also for public use. And then Malaysia also continued to be receptive and also enthusiastic despite Mahathir's suspension. But the distinction between Laos and Malaysia in quadrant 1 and 2 is that both are receptive, enthusiastic, but Laos is more stable, whereby Malaysia fluctuates. There's a cyclical recalibration. And we could see that from Mahathir's decision to suspend, to renegotiate. But once negotiation is done, you will see that Malaysia again is back on track to continue the China-backed project, particularly ECRL, East Coast Rail Link. And after Mahathir, we have two more governments, Mohideen and also now Ismail Sabri. The decisions actually remain, although there have been some changes in terms of the southern alignment. We might come to that during the Q&A. But now let me move on to Thailand and Vietnam. So you could see that Thailand and Vietnam, in comparison, are more cautious and less receptive compared to Malaysia and Laos. And then we have been talking about the case of Thailand and the phase 1, phase 2. You could see that they are generally moving, but slowly. Phase 1 from Bangkok to Korat, it's being implemented, started from the 3.5 kilometer, but we understand that the phase 2 from Korat to Nong Khai continued to be under negotiation. So that showed the pattern of Thailand that is very selective, flexible, and also very cautious. But at least in Thailand, things are moving. For Vietnam, Vietnam has made it very clear that it's a very limited involvement. The only case which relates China-backed rail project is the only case of the urban rail project in Hanoi. And it has been going through a very long delay. And then, but other than that, there is no other project. So what explained that? What explains why Malaysia and Laos are more receptive than Thailand and Vietnam? So this is where the first axis about the legitimation on top of these metrics come to a picture. So legitimation is the main factor that explains why some countries are more enthusiastic, more receptive to China-backed projects than the others. So economic legitimation, performance legitimation matters a lot in countries like Laos and also Malaysia and also Cambodia. So economic needs we need the infrastructure for economic growth and all that, push the government of the day to be more receptive towards China back, in fact, other big powers back the projects as well. But in Thailand and Vietnam, economic performance clearly is also important. However, there are other sources of legitimation, for example, identity-based legitimation. Anti-China nationalism, for example, is the reason that explains why under different leaders in Hanoi, Vietnam continued to be very, very cautious and very selective towards Belt and Road and also China-backed project. In the case of Thailand, it's not so much about anti-China nationalism, but it's about the Thai identity. So during our fieldwork, we have heard many Thai elites telling us that the negotiation process with China has been taking so long, in part mainly because of there are some terms that China put forward are not agreeable to Thailand, and Thai insists that this is Thailand, we do things in Thai way. So identity play a part in offset, and Thailand would put more emphasis on their own, the double tracking project in Isan, along Isan. So you have time, you can wait. And of course, the alternative also play a big part. So, and what explains why Malaysia is more fluctuate than Laos, and also Thailand is more flexible than the case of Vietnam. So I think the other domestic factor, the power pluralization, how domestic power is being distributed across elites and also society play a big role. Laos is very one-party dominant, so any decision that we made, same with Vietnam, would continue. More receptive and also less receptive, and it's kind of relatively stable. But in countries like Malaysia and also Thailand, because of the more pluralistic aspect of the system, political system, you see that things are being revisited and also changed. The case of Malaysia, Arjan mentioned about the case of Malaysia's political system. So for first 61 years of our country since independence, we never have any change of government. But over the last 3 years, we have 3 different governments. So that clearly is a source of fluctuation and also revisiting of the decision being made. But overall, we still to be relatively receptive. So for the remaining time, Dave, if you could help us to display the final slide that we have. I would like to cover about the, and next slide, please. The geoeconomics and also geopolitical aspect. Next one, yeah. That is, okay, so from here, again, the changes that have been taking place after the completion of our book actually confirm the logics and also the themes that we put forward here, which is that geoeconomics and geopolitics go hand in hand. In fact, by now, we could argue that in the 21st century, geoeconomics are geopolitics. And this is confirmed not just about China's growing reliance on Belt and Road, which is an economic statecraft, to pursue its geopolitical goals and also domestic goals. But you could also see from the fact that there are other powers, big powers, Japan, but also others, also try to compete with China's Belt and Road, and also involve and offer alternative schemes to smaller countries, not just in Southeast Asia, but also all over the world. Of course, in Southeast Asia, we all know that Japan has always been a pioneering, very active developmental partner when it comes to infrastructure project. But earlier on, Japan's motive is more economic and geoeconomics rather than geopolitics. But Belt and Road clearly has changed this equation in which geopolitics have become much important driver for Japan to involve and also to offer infrastructure development projects. And we could see during Abe time in 2015, Tokyo actually launched a partnership. It's kind of repackaged what they have been doing into something that is called as a partnership for quality infrastructure. And interestingly, and that's something that we already observed while writing the book, is that Japan has been doing that to compete with China on infrastructure development, not just alone by its own partnership for quality infrastructure. But Japan has also kind of lobbied and also partnered and persuaded other partners, US, but also quadrilateral member states, Australia and India, to come up with something similar in order to be seen as alternative for smaller countries in Southeast Asia and elsewhere to see that, you have other options other than Belt and Road. So I think the latest example would be EU Asia connectivity strategy, and recently they kind of also frame it as a more globally connected Europe. And we know that this month there are going to be a major document coming out from EU when it comes to Indo-Pacific and also the connectivity strategy. And G7, B3W, the Build Back Better World that Ajahn Thitinan mentioned earlier on is clear and an example. And that is on top of the earlier scheme of the so-called Blue Dot Network that involve primarily the quadrilateral member countries. But now we are also talking about the possibility of Quad Plus. So I think these geoeconomics and geopolitical dynamics continue. And generally, and that would be my final point to sum up my session, would be from small countries' perspective, Selina mentioned about smaller state agency. Clearly, smaller countries welcome more alternative, the more the merrier. And in fact, we welcome big powers, China and also other competing powers, compete to collaborate so that we can have better choices and better options to negotiate that meet our domestic needs without creating any external instability. But I think the challenge here is that competing powers need to walk the talk. I think announcing, implementing, launching is one thing, but what we are seeing on table will be another matter. And that will be one of the decisive factors that will determine the pace, but also the future of how geoeconomics, geopolitics in our century. I will stop here. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cheng-Chwee. It's a very rich presentation. Apart from railroads, rivers of iron, there's also a river of water. There's a Mekong River, and the Mekong region. We can see this region has different frames. On the one hand, part of the BRI, the corridors, but on the other hand, it's mainland Southeast Asia. It's a kind of the mainland part of Southeast Asia, and then yet we can also see it as the Mekong region. So I think here the overlapping concentric frames of development, geopolitics, geoeconomics that you discussed, Cheng-Chwee, very much at work and in play. We'll expand on that a little bit, but in the meantime, I want to maybe invite our discussant, Dr. Arm Tungnirun. From what you've heard, Dr. Arm, and in view of the book, BRI is very ambitious. It's a geostrategy. I see it as a kind of a China's maybe a manifest resurgence, if you will. If you look at the map of the Belt and the Road, it harks back many centuries to the former glory, greatness of China long ago, and it's kind of coming back. But it also faces obstacles and challenges, and we've heard some of them, but yet it's still very much on track. What do you think, Ajahn Arm? Where is China going with this? Is BRI going to, we're going to see it for the long term, and will it be fulfilled as envisioned? Dr. Arm.
Thank you very much, Ajahn Thitinan, for inviting me to join the panel. And especially, thank you, Professor Lampton, Professor Ho, and Professor Kuik for your very enlightening presentation. And I'm a big fan of your work, and truly, this is a very important book. It's an impressive cross-country comparative study. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of fundamental issues that doesn't really change even with the new geopolitical struggle between the US and China, and even with the COVID pandemic. To respond to Ajahn Thitinan's question, I have mainly 5 observations about the railway diplomacy, and also what's going on with the Belt and Road initiative, and also to provide some comments on the book. The first point I would like to make is that I think there's a misinterpretation and overestimation by both China and smaller nations, including Thailand, for one another's aspiration. To put it simply, it's the question of who won this railroad more, right? I think there's a sentiment in your interviews with the Thai colleagues that, China really wants this railway. China really wants this Belt and Road strategy is very important to China's expansion of influence in the region. There's this idea that, there's no use to build a railway into Laos without connecting it into Thailand, right? And there's this idea also that Professor Lampton mentioned that, it's very important and key to Xi Jinping's strategy. So, if you talk to a lot of Thai elites, there's this idea that, China really wants this. It's so important. We have a lot of bargaining power. Then, when I talk with the Chinese colleagues, a lot that I hear, and a lot that I heard from them is that Thailand really wants this rail line. And again, same rationalization, there's no use for the rail to stop in Laos without Thailand connecting it to this Laos railway so that we can connect it to China. There's this idea that I think Professor Lampton also mentioned that, if you look at the map, Thailand should be at the center of all this connection. So it's actually, very beneficial to Thailand's development. So Thailand should really want this, right? And so in the bargaining process and in the negotiation process, I think there's this idea that, the other side wanted that more than we do, and that we have a lot of bargaining power. And then I'm not so sure, right? Because in the end, what we see is actually that truly, in terms of China, they think that, if it happened, well, that's good, but they don't really, that, it need to happen, right? And from Thailand side, I think, as we mentioned, it's only, I think that we only build, we are building 3.5 kilometers for the first phase, right? And the idea is also that, if it happened, then that's good, but it's not like the first priority of the nation kind of thing. The second observation, and perhaps related to the first one, is that the fluctuation of strategy of both China and smaller nations. I think there's a lot of assumption when we talk about this railway diplomacy, that we think that there's a static strategy, both in terms of China and both in terms of the smaller nations, including Thailand. But actually, if we look throughout the past 4 to 5 years, there's a lot of fluctuation, and not only from the Thai side, as Professor Kuik mentioned, that there's a lot of factors that might explain that. But I also think that also on the Chinese side, I think that we normally assume that China has this very static, very consistent, does not change, the strategy, the overall grand strategy. And that's perhaps true. I think that the Belt and Road is here to stay. I think that China's grand strategy of expanding their influence in the region is here to stay. China's rivalry with the US is here to stay. But I think that the detail, right, and also the priority of the policy compared to other priorities within China actually change. And I think that, when we talk about this Belt and Road, one thing that I want everyone to keep in mind is that Belt and Road is a grand term. Actually, you can put anything within the contour of the Belt and Road, right? And I think that, will not be so surprising that, in the 5 years from now, what is inside the Belt and Road, or how you interpret the Belt and Road might be a little bit different. Or a big difference from how Xi Jinping described or explained the Belt and Road, when he started the initiative 5 years ago, and that's also true. I think with Xi Jinping's strategy, I think in the past 10 years, actually, I think we assume very different things from Xi Jinping. I think when he first took power, a lot of people think that, he will liberalize the economy. He talked about market reform. Now, it's all the reverse of all this trend, right? So I think that we have to keep this in mind, that there's a big prospects for fluctuation of strategy in both sides. And in Thailand, for example, I think with different political parties taking power, there's also a lot of prospects for fluctuation of our strategies towards the railways and towards connecting with China. The third observation, I will go through it very quick, is the question of control. And I think there's a lot of debates in Thailand who will control the railway if it's being constructed, who will really determine the use of the railway, right? And I think there are two levels of control. The first level is to indicating standards, indicating technology, right? And I think the idea from the Chinese side is that now the railway is really connecting Laos with China with Chinese technology. So if the Thai side want to connect with Laos and with China, then we will have to use Chinese railway technology. And it would be impossible for us, to choose to use European or the Japanese technology and standards. And that's perhaps also explain why, China thinks that in the end, right, we will have to buy Chinese products, buy Chinese technology for our railway. So that's one level of control, right? Who sets the standard, who sets the technology. The second level of control is, who sets the rules of the use of these railways, right? And that is the debate in Thailand, right? That how many percentage of shares should we give to the Chinese companies? That's a long debate within the negotiation process of whether it will be 50-50. And in the end, right, we decided we will invest 100%. And that's perhaps related to Professor Kuik's mentioning of, that we are Thai, right? We need to be independent. We need to keep our identity. That's types of rationalization. But this, I think, issue of control is a very important one. The fourth point is this very interesting idea, and I think you mentioned it in the book from the start, right? Talking about the history of railway construction in the region, and it's this big question of whether this is a imposed idea from outside powers, right? Even in the past, it will be colonial powers, European powers. They all have this big ambitions of building a railway system within the Southeast Asian region. Is it an imposed idea from the Chinese side, or is it there's some indigenous support, indigenous idea within the region? And I think this relates to the question of why the railway is important. In China, for example, when I study in China during my undergraduate years, there's a lot of talks that we need to build a railway system because of several reasons, not just development reasons, not just about infrastructure, but also about unification, also about idea of industrialization, urbanization, right? So there's this strong sentiment within China that building railways is really related to economic development and to unification of the regime, right? And I think this idea dates back to Sun Zhongshan's, people talk that, actually the vision of building, these big rail lines in China date back to Sun Zhongshan. There's also this idea in the US, as Professor Lampton mentioned, and, I study in my law school years that, the history of American law can actually be explained through the railway construction, the change in torts law, the change in industrialization. So this strong sentiment, they have it in China, but not so much in smaller nations. Perhaps as Professor Kuik mentioned, right, we see it in Malaysia, we see it in Laos, perhaps to a certain degree, but not so much in Vietnam and not so much in Thailand, right? Of course, we want economic development, but the idea that railway construction is really, the key to everything. I don't think there's this sentiment within the country. And I think that the idea of selling to China, of opening up for China's influence, the idea of the debt trap, right? This idea or contributes to our cautious approach to the Chinese railway. And the final point, Professor, that I want to make is that the book and in your discussion you talk a lot about how domestic politics within smaller nations actually complicate the negotiation or influence the negotiation, right? And I think that going forward, the domestic politics will be a lot more complex and complicated. With the U.S. and China rivalry, and with the U.S. and China putting ideology into their contest. That one side is the liberal model, right, and the other side is another model, and I'm not sure what to call the Chinese model. But then this has huge implications within domestic politics in this region. For example, in Thailand, right, I think that the two political camps both make this a domestic political issue, right? And we see this not just in railway diplomacy, but we see it very clearly in the recent vaccine diplomacy, right? And I think that going forward, this will be a tricky one that smaller nations within the domestic politics sphere have to address and handle. And this would relate also to Ajahn Thitinan's mention about public opinion. And I think that with the initiation of the 3BW initiative by the G7 nations, this will also complicate the contest within the country between the two political camps or the two spectrums of whether we are going to cooperate or siding or taking investment from China or from the Western sphere. So I will end my discussion here and look forward to hearing your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ajahn. This is a very good contribution. I think also the points you raised about, especially about the control and the how it's perceived, and the Chinese railroads, also the issue of domestic politics and the idea of the rail. We're not so used to rail as much as road. There's been a lot of road construction. In fact, the Greater Mekong sub-region, the GMS, earlier 3 decades ago, focused on north, south, east, west, and there have been massive road connectivity from all across mainland Southeast Asia. You can drive physically from Bangkok to Da Nang, for example. Now we have a lot on the table. I know that we have about 20 minutes left, close to 20 minutes. I'm just going to pose this question a little bit and invite the 3 authors to respond in their own preferred way. The domestic politics angle here, Dr. Selina talked about agency and leverage for the smaller states. There are also a couple of questions about whether ASEAN has the ASEAN governments have coordinated in their negotiations. Can they negotiate collectively vis-a-vis China? There's a question about Laos has been kind of overwhelmed by China because it doesn't have partners in negotiations by itself as a small state. But on the domestic politics, I note, this is it must be a big concern for China. I mean, what's happening in Thailand? Thailand has basically stymied and dragged its feet on building the rail through the northeast to Bangkok, because the Thai authorities, even though they were partial, they were kind of seeking support from China after the coup in 2014. When they saw that the terms were unfair, they dragged their feet. And I think China, the Chinese government, is not very smart, does not seem tuned in to these domestic nuances. In Myanmar, there's a lot of anti-China sentiment. In Laos, I think if you go throughout through the region, through the countries and recipients of BRI projects, partner countries, and you talk to governments, they'll say one thing. But if you do public opinion surveys, as Dr. Selina has alluded to, you get a very different opinion. There's a lot of anti-Chinese sentiments in Myanmar. I think a lot of skepticism even in Cambodia. But governments are pro-China. Peoples are not. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. This is an ambitious, kind of a geostrategy to promote, I think, achieve China's former greatness. But I think now, and we have to also address the pandemic, the COVID a little bit. There have been some setbacks now. There were some pushbacks earlier pre-COVID, but during COVID and after COVID, I think there will be some setbacks, serious setbacks to China's BRI. And I'm sure they know about it in Beijing. But I'll turn it over. I'll get back now to Professor Lampton in view of the discussion, and then Selina and then Cheng-Chwee. Professor Lampton, does China know what it's doing in the long term?
Well, China isn't a unitary actor, and talked about BRI, in a sense, being a slogan rather than a detailed project strategy. And I think that's really true. There's a sort of broad vision of connectivity, and China as the hub. And that's a shared vision, I think, widely in China. But then you have provinces and municipalities and state enterprises, and they all have their own interests and they push their pet projects. And Beijing often doesn't know what's going on, sometimes quite until they're quite committed to a project. So I think it's very important not to treat China as too much of a unitary actor. And that gets to the very important point. You were talking about domestic politics, and you meant the domestic politics in Southeast Asia. And that's very true. And I agree with everything that Professor Thitinan and Arm said. But China has domestic politics too. There are people in China asking, why should we be building railroads in Laos that will lose money for a long time when we have so many needs, whether it's hospitals, schools, infrastructure in China? China has huge needs. So there's a very active criticism of many of these projects. For instance, at Tsinghua University, where many of the leaders themselves are trained. So all I would say is it's not only an inhibiting factor of the domestic politics in Southeast Asia, there also are critical constituencies in China. They may not be able to stop projects, but I think they can at least affect their implementation. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I think the latter remark that Professor Thitinan just mentioned, we were struck when we went to Sihanoukville in Cambodia. That, in some sense, has been a cultural, I don't want to say wasteland, but there are casinos, corruption, and everything that comes along with it there. It seemed quite clear to us that the Cambodians not very happy with the cultural implications of such a heavy Chinese presence. So also, I was in Burma, they're not very happy with the Chinese presence in northeast, in the north part of Burma. Of course, the Vietnamese, as Selina mentioned, unhappy with many things, China's maritime policies on territory, but also had a very unhappy experience with the Chinese light rail in Hanoi. So the point is that all of these countries have to walk a tightrope between getting the benefits of dealing with China and not falling victim to the, what you might call, negative side effects of that. So all I would say is all of these countries, including China, have heavy-duty politics. Now, in Laos and in China, you got the Communist Party, and in the end, they can push policies that, with a greater uniformity, than the more pluralistic countries like Thailand and Malaysia and Singapore, Indonesia. So that's where that political structure comes in. But everybody's got domestic politics. I just want to say one other, what I thought was very important point that's emphasized in the book that Professor Arm mentioned. And that is, a lot of this is about setting standards. If you sell the first generation of technology, say high-speed rail, and China wins the contract, that means people are going to use Chinese standards, not Japanese or not German. And so the first contracts become very important because they lock you in for subsequent decisions. Now, one of the most interesting conversations we had on this was in Thailand. And we asked precisely this: if you build the Chinese high-speed rail from Nung Khai down to Bangkok, does that mean you're locked into Chinese standards? And they said, well, not always. And then they pointed to the project between Bangkok and Chiang Mai. And they said, we've been talking to the Japanese, and we could imagine a sort of a dedicated route between Bangkok and Chiang Mai that uses Japanese technology. Doesn't necessarily feed into that broader. So it may be that certain sort of projects that can be isolated and not part of the network don't necessarily have to have Chinese. But the vision of the Pan-Asian Railroad, it seems to me, is going to have a pretty great uniformity of standards. And this is why it's so important for whether it's the Europeans, whether it's the United States, whether it's the Canadians, we all have standards that we would like adopted. So a big part of this geoeconomic struggle is who gets the first contracts and sets the standards, because that's going to affect decisions for decades.
Thank you. And that goes also, I think, for technology, high tech as well, Professor Lampton. You know, in Thailand, we use Line, social media app, but also some people also use WeChat. And a lot of people in Thailand use Alibaba, Alipay, for example. So the standards are very important, and there's competition for standards. I'll just come to Selina and Cheng-Chwee a little bit. You know, what China is doing is just, I think it's unprecedented, it's profound in many ways, a dynamic economy, market consistent, and then yet centralized political control. Is it the case, you know, the Chinese Communist Party knows best? Do they know more than the market, more than their people? You know, we talk about BRI, it's really the manifestation of their vision and their role and their ambition to promote influence in the world. How should we, you know, we also have the COVID now with the vaccine diplomacy and the competition for vaccines and so on. How should we be seeing China moving forward, Selina and Cheng-Chwee?
Could I first react to Dr. Arm's remarks, because I think he actually really broadened the discussion beyond the book. And I think that there are 2 points that I actually want to react to, which is that the first about adjustments in strategy. And strategies are dynamic, they are not static, which I totally agree with. And I think that you actually see that happening in China already with the dual circulation strategy, right? Which is in a way a reaction to several things. One is the domestic concerns, which Professor Lampton has mentioned among the people, that why are you spending money outside when and these debts may not be able to be repaid, when we have all these internal needs that need to be met, and obviously also to ensure that you develop your your domestic industries, especially in things like semiconductors, so that you are not reliant on the United States or other markets like Taiwan for it. So definitely adjustments in strategies will change, and we see that. But it does not mean that the external is gone. And I think that the BRI is still a big part of it, because it has to do with Chinese place in the world, and that will not change, which I think Dr. Arm agreed. Now, the other one about standard setting is, one of the things that that was mentioned by Dr. by Professor Lampton and also Professor Titinan, which is that, in technology and we're going beyond the railway now. China is really way ahead in technology standard settings. We are talking about the technology of the future. And when I say they are way ahead, is meaning that they are actually ahead of the United States, because the United States have always been a leader in terms of standard setting. And China has really gone ahead in terms of setting standards in things like 5G, in AI, in robotics and all that. They have been extremely active in the international sphere. They have sent people to sit into, Chinese officials sitting in all these international committees. And Americans have not moved as quickly as that, because Americans use a different approach. They use private approach. So in a way that helps they rely on the private sector to set these standards. So Microsoft, being a leader in the field, end up setting standards subsequently for every other types of similar companies. So in other words, it is an indirect way of trying to answer your question as well, whether China really knows what it's doing, and is it really reflective of a very consistent policy or not. I think there is some bits of that that China has been very deliberate, has been very visionary, but there's also a lot of muddling through. So in Southeast Asia, in the case of the Pan-Asia Railway, they're going to muddle through. This is where Professor Lampton's, his famous work on fragmented authoritarianism is going to come true. China is not a unitary actor, not a rational unitary actor, and there's going to be all this muddling through that is going to continue in a lot of these things, and they will continue to adjust the strategies like the dual circulation strategy, but they are also very, very forward-looking in the way they look at the economies of the future. So if you look at technology standard setting, they know where it's coming, and they are ahead of the game. So that's one thing that I think we should take note of.
Thank you. So I think the point about they're innovating all the time, and also I think recalibrating all the time. So I think for me, to me, this is the key. How much successful, to what extent they can adapt as the situation develops. Dr. Cheng-Chwee, I think we have a few minutes, so please take a couple of minutes, and then we'll try to wrap up.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think both Dr. Arm and also Dr. Titinan have shared very rich and also nuanced points. Let me just pick up two issues that converge between Dr. Arm's 5-point observation and also Titinan's questions. So number one is the issue of whether or not ASEAN countries actually have collective efforts in dealing with China's connectivity strategy in the form of Belt and Road related train issues, and then the second one about the domestic. So for the first issue, I would say that the answer that we can observe is kind of mixed. It's a yes and no. Yes, in the sense that let's take the master plan of ASEAN connectivity, something that Thailand played a big role. I remember that when that became reality in 2010, China was the first one to actually approach ASEAN, trying to actually connect with that ASEAN's own collective plan of connectivity by coming up with what has been called as ASEAN-China connectivity and also ASEAN +3 connectivity. All this happened in 2010, from 2010 to 2012, 2013, right before China came up with their own Belt and Road initiative. So in that sense, you do see that there are some collective efforts on the part of ASEAN, and China tried to come in right on it, but also push their own envelope. But other than that, we could also say that back in 1995 and 1996, during the field work, we actually had a chance to interview Tun Mahathir. And Mahathir shared about his vision in 1995 when he proposed the Singapore Kunming Rail Link. And that was a time that you could see that it's also an indicator, evidence of ASEAN's collective efforts. And interestingly, that particular event actually showed that it was not really China which started to push forward the connectivity scheme. It was smaller countries in Southeast Asia, together actually bring China in even back in mid-1990s. So you could see that there are some collective dimensions, but ultimately the no answer is also because of a lot of these real projects, just like any other infrastructure projects, are primarily national governments. When collaborating with China is a bilateral in nature rather than multilateral or regional. And that actually limit the extent, the space to which ASEAN as a group can play. So you do see multiple level dynamics. And then finally, the issue of a domestic, we would also say that since I'm from Malaysia, let's take Malaysia as an example to respond to Titi Nan's earlier question of whether or not China actually is not sensitive enough about the public opinion in the host country. So you could see that East Coast ruling, ECRL, early on, it's true that China only dealt with the ruling elites, particularly Najib, the former prime minister. But I think China have been showing indicators that they are learning the lesson since Mahathir took over after May 2018 and also started the renegotiation. China did learn lesson by trying to work with the governments of the day, but also took some efforts in dealing with different stakeholders at the societal level. So you could see that the renegotiation of ECRL after April 2019 has been generally well received, and then in that process, shaping the public opinion. So, and that comes back to what Arm mentioned about these dynamics are very, it's not static, but it evolve, and both sides try to push the envelope, but also try to adjust and also adapt accordingly. So fundamentally, I think the point is that, and that's something that Professor Lampton mentioned consistently in the book, which is that ultimately what is good for smaller countries and also China and other power is the notion of balanced connectivity. So we do want to have connectivity projects, infrastructure projects that can be sustained. And one key factor to ensure the sustainability of all these projects in individual host country is to have something that is balanced politically, but also economically, but also domestically. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Cheng-Chwee. And I think the main takeaway perhaps is this is all very dynamic. I'll come back to the book. It's not static, so it's about adaptability. It's a superpower that is learning by doing, and I think that is the key to its success. And also the challenges that will arise in the future depends on whether China can adapt and can learn by doing in Southeast Asia and beyond. So I'll just come back to the book again. The rivers of iron, Chinese railroads, the railroads and Chinese power in Southeast Asia. And it's highly recommended. I think it will transcend the pandemic, the fundamental issues in the book. There's some chapters I really like about geopolitics, geoeconomics particularly. So I want to thank now, time is up to Professor Lampton, Dr. Selina Ho, Dr. Cheng-Chwee Kuik. I know that it's late in where you are, Professor Lampton, in the US, so thank you especially to you for dressing up and for being with us late at night. And then to my friends and colleagues, Dr. Selina Ho and Dr. Cheng-Chwee Kuik, and my colleague at Chulalongkorn University, Dr. Arm Tungnirun. Thank you very much to all viewers. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
สวัสดีครับ